You know how sometimes you're trying to get your head around something complex and the usual explanations just miss the mark? They feel, I don't know, incomplete.
Yeah, like they're just scratching the surface.
Exactly. Well, that's what we're digging into today. We're doing a deep dive into a really personal take on autism spectrum disorder, specifically looking at the diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5-TR.
Right, the manual clinicians use.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting here is our source. It's an essay by Dr. Jaime Hoerricks called Not a Deficit, Living the DSM from the Inside.
Mm-hmm. And that's the key part, living the DSM from the inside. This isn't just theory, it's firsthand experience from an autistic person.
It really is. It offers this incredible window into how those clinical descriptions actually feel day to day.
So our goal today is to kind of push past that clinical language. We want to explore what Dr. Hoerricks describes the lived reality of autism. We're looking at the limits of those diagnostic boxes and hopefully uncovering some, well, surprising insights into autistic perception.
Okay, so where do we start? Dr. Hoerricks kicks off by talking about their reaction to the DSM description for level 2 support needs.
Yeah, what was it about those descriptions?
Well, it was the language itself. Terms like persistent deficits, marked impairments, reduced or abnormal responses. Dr. Hoerricks felt these words just flattened their whole experience.
Reduced it all down to a sterile set of problems, I think was the phrase used. It's that feeling of dislocation, right? Like the description is about you, but doesn't actually see you.
Precisely. It wasn't necessarily that the observations were totally wrong from the outside looking in, but they completely missed the internal landscape, the richness of it.
And instead of those clinical terms, Dr. Horrocks offers their reality, this lifelong, nuanced system of pattern recognition, exhaustion, and guarded hope. That paints a totally different picture, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It shifts the focus from what's supposedly lacking to an active, intense way of processing the world. And a big part of that is how they handle information, particularly verbal and auditory stuff.
Right, and it's not just described as like a learning difference in isolation. It's part of what they call a complex gestalt reality.
Yeah, meaning comes in all at once. Waves, fragments, tones, whole emotional constellations. It's not linear, A plus B equals C. It's bigger, more connected.
Which, as they explain, means they have to listen incredibly intensely, not just to the words.
But to the how, the tone, the unspoken things, the feeling underneath the words, that tremor under the syllables.
Wow. It sounds like a huge amount of processing power is constantly engaged. And they say it's a necessity, right, to grasp the whole meaning.
Exactly. And that ties directly into this idea of hyperempathy they talk about.
Hyper-empathy. So, like, empathy turned way up.
Pretty much. An amplified sensitivity to what others are feeling.
Yeah.
And when the words someone says don't match the emotions being picked up, that's where the problem lies.
Ah, so it creates a dissonance, a conflict.
Yeah, Dr. Hoerricks calls it a short circuit. The system gets overloaded by the mismatch. It's not a failure to understand the words, it's understanding the inconsistency too well, too deeply.
Okay, so if they withdraw socially, it might not be misunderstanding cues. It could actually be from understanding too much too quickly too completely. That flips the script on typical interpretations.
It really does. And this leads into their analogy for what happens when that sensory or emotional input just becomes too much to handle.
The circuit breaker, right.
Exactly. It's like an internal switch flips. It's a self-preservation thing, protecting them from, complete disorientation when the environment feels unlivable.
And the support they need, the level 2 support, isn't necessarily about reminders or social stories, the kind of standard things you might think of.
No, it's more fundamental. It's about regulation, containment, a stable, attuned environment. Basically, creating conditions where that breaker is less likely to trip.
Because social interaction itself is cumulative work. They mention constantly tracking tone, decoding faces, compensating for cues, and that effort actually gets harder with people they know well sometimes.
Which is counterintuitive, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it makes sense if the system is always on high alert, always processing. The stakes feel higher with familiar people, maybe.
So when that breaker trips, it's crucial to understand it's not avoidance, it's not refusal.
It's about nervous system integrity, as they put it. The body essentially saying, nope, this connection isn't safe or sustainable right now. It really challenges those negative assumptions about autistic withdrawal.
It absolutely does. Now, Dr. Hoerricks also looks back at growing up in the 70s before their diagnosis. They use this term, ghost diagnosis. What's that about?
It really speaks to the lack of understanding back then. There just weren't the right frameworks, especially for autistic girls or women or people who didn't fit the very narrow stereotype that existed.
So instead of a diagnosis, they just got labels, like odd, overly sensitive, too intense.
Right. Labels that dismissed the actual neurological differences. They didn't explain anything. They just judged.
And looking back, they identify clear signs using scripted language, echolalia.
Repeating phrases, yeah. And processing the world in those meaning-laden holes, plus the intense sensory stuff. It's a reminder of how many people must have gone through that, completely unrecognized.
And childhood social interactions sound like they were incredibly difficult. Confusing rules, lying, exclusion, bullying, things they described as absolutely mystifying.
And when you constantly face things you can't make sense of, and there's no external explanation, you internalize it, right? You start to feel like you're the problem. Wrong, broken, fundamentally unlikable.
Which leads directly to masking. Trying to hide the differences, blend in, just to survive socially.
But it's exhausting. Dr. Hoerricks makes it clear that masking isn't sustainable. That internal breaker kept tripping despite the immense effort to conform. It just highlights that constant internal battle.
It really does. Okay, so then they take on the actual DSM criteria piece by piece from their internal viewpoint. Let's start with deficits in social emotional reciprocity. How does that land for them?
Well, it's almost the opposite of their experience. The term suggests a lack, but Dr. Hoerricks describes feeling too much and this deep, deep yearning for genuine reciprocal connection, something they call sacred.
So far from being uninterested, they actually tend to over-respond, invest really heavily when a connection feels real.
Exactly, because it's so valued. But the issue arises when that reciprocity isn't there, or it's inconsistent, conditional. It's not that they don't give, it's that the return signal feels absent or unreliable.
And that lack of reliable back and forth leads to exhaustion and this feeling of disconnection. They described it as an internal click, a sudden absence of charge.
Right. And crucially, it feels like abandonment, not confusion.
Yeah.
Like the connection just died. And they used to blame themselves, think they were too much.
But now they see it as maybe an overextension into spaces that couldn't hold what I offered.
Right.
That's such a powerful reframe.
It is. Okay, next criterion. Deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interaction.
Yeah, the idea of markedly odd nonverbal communication, that word odd, implies there's one right way to communicate nonverbally.
Exactly. It assumes a neurotypical baseline is the only valid one. But for Dr. Hoerricks, nonverbal isn't just about standard gestures or facial expressions. It's more about energy, presence, those invisible signals that hum between people.
They talk about picking up on tiny things, a hesitation, a gaze held too long, a micropause. And it's not conscious analysis. It lands like static in their system.
Yeah, a feeling of unease or dissonance. They mention sensing when someone's masking, even without knowing exactly why. And when that disconnect is felt, the internal system starts to struggle.
So what might look odd from the outside, maybe sudden silence, different gaze patterns, stillness isn't necessarily deliberate.
No, they describe it as the body going into conservation mode. It's an involuntary physiological response before overload hits. A sign that the internal reality and the external interaction aren't matching up anymore.
Again, it comes back to self-preservation, not social awkwardness for its own sake. Okay, third criterion. Deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships.
And here Dr. Hoerricks expresses a very real desire for closeness, for deep connection, but also acknowledges the huge difficulty in navigating relationships based on typical social rules that just feel wrong somehow, counterintuitive.
They use that image of trying to hold water in cupped hands, the sheer effort of trying to maintain things according to external norms.
Because for them, connection is full body, full self.
Yeah.
It's not superficial.
Oh.
So even small shifts in a relationship feel huge internally, like a tidal change.
And when that shift happens, the connection feels inaccessible, not because they choose to pull away, but almost automatically.
Right. It's not a failure to understand relationships in theory. It's understand the dynamics so intensely that they feel the connection fade before it's even spoken. They sense the withdrawal in others.
So their own withdrawal isn't rejecting the person, but responding to the impossibility of staying connected when the voltage between us no longer matches. The energy just isn't flowing right.
That's a great way to put it. And this brings us back to those level 2 support needs. Dr. Hoerricks really pushes back against the typical external view found in manuals.
Which focuses on observable things, needing prompts, visible difficulties.
Yeah. But Dr. Hoerricks emphasizes the invisible needs. The huge emotional labor of masking, the constant effort of sensory processing, that internal negotiation between their world and the external one.
Outwardly, someone might seem high functioning, but that term hides the real cost. They call it functioning expensively.
I like that term. Because the price is paid later, right?
Mm.
And delayed crashes, needing long recovery times after simple interactions, needing silence.
So the level 2 support needed isn't necessarily about help with tasks, it's about the environment. Things like having scripts ready for certain situations, guaranteed recovery time, safe spaces.
Exactly. Preventing the overload in the first place. And they also mentioned something really poignant, the feeling of being required in a space, maybe for your skills, versus being truly welcomed for who you are.
That lonely kind of indispensability, present, useful, but not really seen or connected, that sounds incredibly isolating.
It does.
Yeah.
Now, there's another layer here. Dr. Hoerricks talks about hormone replacement therapy acting as a kind of rewiring. How did that change things?
Well, they describe it bringing this new emotional clarity, immediate feelings, emotions arriving without delay, without detour, without the familiar fog.
So much more intense, direct emotional experiences.
Yes. Which, while valuable for self-understanding, also made things harder in some ways. Articulating those intense, unfiltered feelings became more difficult, and those short circuits in interactions felt even more jarring.
And they lost the buffer they had before, the thing that helped manage the double empathy problem.
Right. That gap in understanding between neurotypes. Now the disconnects are felt instantly, undeniably, painfully sometimes.
But that clarity, even though difficult, helps prevent self-gaslighting, right?
Yeah.
Stops them staying in situations that aren't genuinely supportive.
Exactly. It forces a certain honesty. So after the breaker trips, in this state of heightened attunement, what did they realize about past experiences?
They realized that times they felt abandoned or like they failed weren't always about them. Often, it was others managing their own energy around the interaction, masking themselves or just braving it until they couldn't anymore.
Wow. So the feeling was often one of being tolerated, not seen, not joined. That's a tough realization.
Incredibly tough.
Yeah.
But ultimately, Dr. Hoerricks values that painful knowing over the false comfort of misreading the room, and they honor the breaker for protecting them before they get burned out.
It's about facing the truth of the connection, however hard, instead of pouring energy into something unsustainable.
Okay, so wrapping up, what are the final thoughts on the DSM and the need for change?
The perspective offered is that the DSM, maybe unintentionally, acts as a ledger of how our systems fail neurodivergent people. That the deficits and abnormalities it lists aren't inherent flaws.
More like scars left by being too sensitive in a world that rewards insensitivity. The view is that autistic people aren't broken, but wired in ways that are exquisitely, sometimes unbearably, responsive to relational harm.
And the circuit breaker isn't a defect. It's a crucial survival mechanism, protecting against dissonance, one-sided relationships, internalizing failure.
Exactly. What's needed are spaces that don't demand overload just to belong. Spaces that don't confuse quietness with agreement or presence with compliance. Spaces that actually honor different ways of being wired.
There's also a mention of the current climate and the concern about finding or even needing to build these supportive spaces, perhaps elsewhere.
Yeah, a note of pragmatism there. The ultimate desire is for a place where proving your humanity isn't a constant requirement, where connection doesn't always end in silence and exhaustion, where the breaker doesn't have to trip so often because your wiring is genuinely valued.
So wrapping this up, the real heart of it is that massive gap between the clinical labels for autism and the actual lived, intensely felt experience that Dr. Hoerricks shares so powerfully.
Absolutely. We get these incredible insights into the intensity of autistic attunement, that hyper-awareness, and the real meaning behind the circuit breaker. It's about protection, not pathology.
And it really makes you think, doesn't it? How might things change our understanding, our support systems, if we actually centered these internal experiences instead of just focusing on external behaviors we might not even be interpreting correctly?
Which leads to a final thought for you, listening. How can we all play a part in creating those spaces that don't push to overload just to belong? Not just for autistic people, but really for anyone whose way of being doesn't quite fit the standard mold, whose sensitivities are often invisible or dismissed. That feels like a really important question to sit with.